Welcome to the UO Today podcast, conversations that offer a glimpse into the heart of the humanities at the University of Oregon. Listen as our faculty, students, and guests introduce ideas and research that help us reflect on the past, navigate the present, and imagine possible futures. I'm Leah Middlebrook, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Smadar Ben-Natan, Assistant Professor of Global Studies in the Schnitzer School of Global Studies and Languages at the University of Oregon. Professor Ben-Natan's research focuses on human rights, international law, Palestine-Israel, armed conflict, criminal justice, incarceration, and colonialism. Her research and teaching examine law, politics, and inequality on the local and global levels, focusing on penal regimes in the context of colonialism and conflict, and primarily in Palestine-Israel. Before transitioning to academia, she was a practicing lawyer of human rights and criminal defense in Israel and Palestine. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for talking to me.
I thought we might get started just by asking you to tell us a bit about your background.
So I was born and raised in Israel, and I became a lawyer. I practiced for almost 18 years, just like you said, as a human rights and criminal defense lawyer. And then I transitioned to academia. I did a master's in international human rights law at the University of Oxford, and then a PhD in law still in Israel. And then I moved to the United States and started my career here, and was very, very happy to start at the University of Oregon last year.
And why did you decide to come and pursue your academic career in the United States, if you are willing to share that?
Yeah, so coming from a small state like Israel, it's kind of expected that if you start an academic career, you also have some international experience. So you also engage with academic audiences outside Israel. And I have this exciting opportunity that I was able to come as a visiting scholar to the Center of the Study of Law and Society at UC Berkeley, which is really one of the best centers to this interdisciplinary study of the law in society. So not just the law as lawyers study it, but how the law functions as a social institution. So I spent time at UC Berkeley, and it was a great experience. And I had some other personal reasons to stay here in the United States. My entire family and I moved here, and I'm very happy that I did that.
Tell us a little bit about your dissertation work.
So my dissertation work was about the military courts that Israel operates currently in the West Bank, but those military courts have a longer history since the British mandate on Palestine, since the 1930s, which I studied in the dissertation. My entry point to this topic was that I practiced in these military courts as a defense attorney. And these courts were nothing like what I studied in law school. They were a different type of law in a different type of context that was very, very different. So they raised many questions that my initial education could not answer, and they sparked my curiosity to look for answers for these questions. And when I started looking at it, so the initial focus, when most scholars who study the military courts and most human rights organizations who write about these courts, they focus on the West Bank and formerly the Gaza Strip, so the occupied Palestinian territories. And their starting point is 1967. So when Israel occupied these territories and operated according to the international law of occupation in establishing these military courts. But when I started studying them, my initial question was, how does the law treat the enemy? So how does a legal system is different when you're adjudicating not your own people, but a different people and a people that is in a situation of conflict or hostility? How does that change the context of the legal process? So beginning with this concept of the enemy, I started looking at different military courts, and I actually discovered that they did not begin in 1967, and they were not only inside Israel. So I studied the military courts that the British operated in Palestine before Israel was established, and then military courts that Israel operated inside Israel before 67.
Mhm.
Um, and the people who were adjudicated in these courts were Palestinians who became citizens of Israel. So, despite the fact that they were citizens, they were still charged in military courts, like the Palestinians we see today in the occupied territories.
Mhm.
And since I started with the concept of the enemy, it was
Mhm.
kind of a contradiction to see that citizens were placed in that same category of an enemy, or actually in a kind of a hybrid category of citizen enemies, that you can
Mhm.
actually inhabit both of these positions. There's a relationality between the position of the citizen and the position of the enemy. And from that point, I started thinking about military courts, not so much in the individual way that human rights scholars and organizations think about them as having violating the individual rights of the defendant. So fair trial and things like that. But what is their bigger role in constructing the membership regime or the citizenship regime, or how populations are being treated differently and incorporated into citizenship or excluded from it, and inhabit these hybrid positions between citizen and enemy.
Mhm.
Um, so I studied decisions of military courts, and I studied all types of archival materials from these earlier military courts and in these different locations. And I interviewed legal professionals who were part of these military courts, former judges and former prosecutors and lawyers. Um, and I kind of created this institutional profile of the different articulations of military courts across Israeli history in different periods, at different times, and with relation to different populations. And what I show is that for every population that was in some way incorporated or constructed in a different way, there was a military court that was established.
Mhm.
And sometimes these military courts after that are abolished. And all of these changes actually demonstrate changes in the status of these populations vis-a-vis the state and the citizenship regime and the understanding of citizenship.
Very interesting. And then is that project now the topic of your first book? Is that what you've been working on?
Yes, this is exactly it. So I published a few articles on this research, and I'm currently writing a book that will be based on that research, and that continues it in a few ways. Yes.
Hmm. Hmm. Do you have a title for the book, or is it still in
Yes.
progress? Yeah.
The title of the book is Citizen Enemies, Military Courts and Colonization in Palestine and Israel.
And I read in my notes that you also have a second project that you're developing. Is that correct? A second book project underway?
Yes, this is a project that I started a few years ago, so more recently. And this project looks at the outcome of these military courts, which
Yeah.
is a large population of Palestinian prisoners
Mm-hmm.
who are sentenced in these courts, and some of them in civilian Israeli courts, and populate Israeli prisons. In fact, ever since 1967, between one third and a half of the total prisoner population in Israel are Palestinians who are not citizens from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And most criminological research doesn't treat this as a central phenomenon, but as something marginal, some kind of an exception to the Israeli carceral system. And I'm saying, no, this is in the heart of the Israeli carceral system. You can't treat a third to a half of your prisoner population as if this is something, in the margins. And very much like my first project, I look at this phenomenon of incarceration encompassing both Israel and its occupied territories under a single framework.
Mm-hmm.
But also, this project builds on my own personal experiences as a lawyer who represented Palestinian prisoners. And one of the ways that this leads my thinking is that I think of the prison as a site of encounter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it is because so many Palestinian prisoners are imprisoned in Israeli prisons. It actually serves as a site of encounter between Palestinians and Israelis
Mm-hmm.
in ways that don't happen outside the prison. So, in fact, there are two main sites of encounter between Palestinians and Israelis. One is the labor market, where Palestinians work in Israel and they meet other Israelis. And the second one is the prison. And a lot of the socialization happens in prison, as it happens in other contexts of mass incarceration, right? Where entire populations are subject to a disproportionate incarceration. It becomes part of their socialization process. So you can see, for example, that Palestinians who were imprisoned in Israel speak Hebrew better than Palestinians who were not. And that is really similar to Palestinians who worked in Israel and were part of the labor market. They know more Israelis, they know more about Israeli politics and Israeli culture and Israeli society because they have this site where they are exposed to all of this. And while, nobody has a good time while they're in prison, it does serve as a type of a university where usually in the radicalization discourse, people speak about prisons as universities for terrorism. But actually, prisons are also universities to the other society.
Mm-hmm.
So I look at processes of both this socialization and these encounters that happen in the prison and how the policies around imprisonment can, on the one hand, bring to a type of radicalization in the sense that there's an escalation in the positions of the people who are involved in this site, but also often and can lead to reconciliation. So to a better understanding of the other society. And it's not coincidental that in other post-conflict contexts, such as Northern Ireland or South Africa, former prisoners took a major role in reconciliation. And it is not coincidental that many Palestinians who are former prisoners go on and take central positions in Palestinian politics because they know Israel better after they have been in prison. And many times they also take leadership position within the prisons. So I want to look more at how the prison experience, although this is not what it's meant for, in fact, can produce under certain conditions that I would want to encourage. A type of reconciliation that can happen. And we are at a rather grim point at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I do believe that reconciliation is possible. And I want to point to this force, this power of Palestinian prisoners that can and did in history, both in Israel-Palestine and in Israel, and in other contexts, became major supporters and advocates for reconciliation.
This is such important work. Tell us a little bit about your work or the work of B'Tselem.
So B'Tselem, which is a Hebrew word that literally means in the image of, and it's taken from um, our Bible and in the image of God, that man was created in the image of God. And it's the major Israeli human rights organization that has been active for many, many years and has a very strong reputation of being a very reliable and professional human rights organization that many people read our reports and consume our what we produce, the data, the testimonies, our website, the reports, etc. And I've been a member of the board of B'Tselem for the last around 10 years. Um, Being a board member, it's not that I'm involved in the daily work of the organization. There's a staff that is working and doing their work every day. The board, in fact, kind of provides um, an oversight, and we discuss and we approve the work plans and strategic decisions that the organization takes. Individually, many of our board members have a type of expertise. So I also lend my expertise to the organization and help when I'm asked to help. So, for example, in the last year, we published 2 reports on the situation of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons. And for those reports, I worked with the staff. I read drafts. We have meetings. I comment on what they're doing. So I try to kind of provide my academic input into the work of the organization.
Let's think a little bit about your work here at the University of Oregon. What classes do you teach?
I teach very exciting classes, and I really enjoy teaching here. So I'll start from the larger courses to the more specific ones. I teach Global 102, which is Foundations for Intercultural Competence. And I tell my students that I do intercultural encounters every day since I'm an immigrant, but also I did that every day in my work. And that we do interact with other cultures in our everyday lives all the time. So in every work environment nowadays, in academic environments, it's not only when we go abroad that we meet people from other cultures. We meet people from other cultures every day. And it's really, this course provides very useful skills and theoretical perspectives to think about cultural difference and how to communicate across difference and how to grow from these intercultural encounters. The second lower division course, sorry, the second larger course that I teach is a Global 370, which is International Human Rights. So it's an introductory course to the human rights world, and we study again various theoretical perspectives on human rights, but also kind of more of a survey of understanding the basic concepts and the basic structure of the human rights system after World War II, and going through civil and political rights, economic and social rights, collective rights, and really looking at it from various perspectives, both globally for looking at different regions of the world and different theoretical perspectives. I teach 2 more specialized courses. One is global carceral studies, where we look at incarceration globally and in comparative perspectives. And that builds a lot on my research. And the other one is political and social histories of Palestine and Israel, which I think it's coming from the same relational approach of looking at how Palestine and Israel, Palestinians and Israelis are interconnected, how they interact with each other, how this context needs to be understood from a relational perspective, and the inclusion of social history, which is the history of the everyday lives of people, not only the big history of politicians and wars and agreements, etc. I think provides students with a more human perspective on Palestine and Israel, and it's a great course that I enjoy a lot teaching, and I think that the students gain a very important perspective on the conflict from taking it. I taught it this fall, and I had great students, and this is one of the things that I really enjoy in the University of Oregon, that our students are so wonderful and they want to learn and they learn a lot, and we learn together, we learn from each other.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, I guess on two levels, because I agree. I have the same experience of UO students, and it is something I think is very, very special. But I also planned on asking you about your perception of UO students. I was interested in actually what kinds of questions, if it's possible to generalize, what kinds of questions are they asking these days? What does it seem that they want to know?
I think a lot of what students are asking reflects the world that we live in the sense that a lot of the information that they're getting from social media, which is giving them very polarized perspectives and also very superficial, like bite-sized insights into more complex issues. And I really feel that they are looking for the complexity and the nuance that we can bring with our academic expertise. I meet students who are very interested in what is happening in the world, what is happening in our own society, students that are passionate about social justice, about environmental justice, about the big issues that our society faces these days. And interrogating these issues with the different academic tools that we have is something that we do together, and I think it's really giving them a deeper perspective that they're looking for.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing that perspective. What attracted you to the University of Oregon? I guess we touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if there's anything else.
Yeah. Um, well, I think there's a really open-minded atmosphere here that really attracted me. I love my department, the Department of Global Studies. I think it's a great department. It's interdisciplinary. I love working in this interdisciplinary contexts. I'm trained as a lawyer, but my research is interdisciplinary. I do socio-legal studies, so that connects sociology and law. And there was just a very good fit between what I wanted to do and teach and pursue and what the department wanted to bring into the university. And I love my colleagues and working with them. And I also love the Pacific Northwest.
What kinds of things about it? Are you an outdoors person or a coffee drinker or
Both.
both? Good, good.
Both.
Okay, then you
Yes,
found a good home.
I love my coffee and I love the outdoors and I love hiking. And I love this weather. Israel is
Yeah,
very hot. I used to really
yeah,
suffer during the summers. I
yeah,
love the cooler weather and I
yeah.
really enjoy it here.
Well, we are so happy to include you in the UO community. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your time today in introducing Oregon UO today to your work.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I have been speaking with Smadar Ben-Natan, Assistant Professor of Global Studies in the Schnitzer School of Global Studies and Languages at the University of Oregon. Our research notes segment helps us keep current on recent developments in University of Oregon faculty and student humanities research, such as the book we will be discussing today, Cinema Before the World: The Global Roots of the Lumière Brothers by Professor Michael Allan. The book was published by Fordham University Press in 2026. Michael Allan is an associate professor of comparative literature and program faculty in cinema studies, Arabic studies, comics and cartoon studies, and Middle East and North African studies. His research focuses on debates in world literature, postcolonial studies, media theory, as well as film and visual culture, primarily in Africa and the Middle East. Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Leah, thank you so much for having me today.
Tell us a little bit about your research interests.
So, as you know, I'm a comparatist, which means I was trained linguistically in Francophone, Arabic, and English literature. And it also means I've trained across fields. So, my primary research fields are postcolonial studies, anthropology, and film and media. But I'd say where a lot of comparatists and many of us in the humanities focus on questions of translation, that is to say, movements between and across languages, I would say most of my research focuses on transmediation, that is to say, kind of the implications of what it is to shift across and between media, such as, the appearance of a photograph in a film or the ricochet of a citation from poetry to a novel, for example.
Thank you for that. And tell us about Cinema Before the World, the global roots of the Lumière brothers.
Yeah, so in the most concrete terms, I'd say that Cinema Before the World is offers a microhistory, what I call a microhistory of world cinema, based on the voyage of one of the camera operators, Alexandre Promiot, who worked for the Lumière Brothers Film Company. But I'd say this question came up for me because in stories of early cinema, they're often narrated as national histories. So did the French Lumière company invent film before the American Edison company, or was it actually the Brits who had experiments in motion photography that constituted the first film? And to me, that just seemed uh, to be at odds with the fact that soon after the Lumière brothers patented the cinematograph in 1895, they sent it all across the globe. So one of the problems of the national film history was that it seemed to circumvent or just ignore the fact that the camera was everywhere from Japan to Canada to Egypt to Palestine within in 1897, so soon after the patenting of the cinematograph. So I would say the book is an effort to reckon with a global history of cinema that doesn't center the production company, the Lumière brothers, or Alexandre Promiot, but thinks about what it is to read images, the first cinematic images from different sites in the globe. So one last detail is this whole project as a story, I think more or less came up with was spawned during graduate school, and I had a professor ask in a course in film historiography whether he could imagine anyone writing an entire seminar paper on one of these 50-second Lumière Brothers films. And everyone kind of laughed because it was seen as sort of an absurdist proposition, but I was like, I'm going to try that. And so I looked at an early Lumière Brothers film that was shot at the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And there I was thinking about what is it to film the pyramid, which exists almost in mythological time, in the vernacular time of the cinematograph, that is the duration of 50 seconds in 1897. And so that paper became kind of both a little method and model that I undertook for the whole book. So each chapter of the book takes one film from Promiot's voyage from Algeria to Egypt to Palestine and thinks of that tension between the world of cinema, that is placing these texts within a world system, but also the world in cinema, that is what is the world that's made visible by attending closely to the dynamics of a 50-second duration of a moving image.
Oh, that just sounds, yeah, no, that sounds brilliant. Um, what makes this topic important to humanity?
So I have to admit, this question's a little curious to me, and we often, it it essentially has me think. And sort of, if I might tell a little bit of a story, which is I like film and literature, or those domains that we understand as culture. How are they important to the world we live in? And when I was an undergrad, I thought I was going to go and study international relations with an interest in working eventually in law. And I was interested in law because that seemed to me a discourse that makes worlds. I was also interested in religion because scripture to me, rather than literature, scripture seemed to be a sort of discourse that makes worlds. It's world producing in its visionary mode, and law is world producing in its policy mode. So then the question of, well, how does a book about uh, by now kind of outmoded media form, these little 50-second films, have any implication for humanity? And I would say I part of what interests me in this project and what animates me as a scholar of film, literature, and culture is a fundamental belief that the world of culture gives us a framework through which we understand the world itself. And nothing could be more pronounced than what it is to apprehend the world in motion and in time. So we could think about how photography has impacted novelists in the 19th century. What happens to description when you have a media form that has this kind of indexical relation to the world, where it captures rather than represents? And I would say the cinematograph attenuates that logic because you have a media form that captures not only an image, but it captures duration and time. And I think for me, reckoning closely with the novelty of that medium means that in turn, I come to understand the contingency of this thing we call a world and the groundedness it provides. And I think, at a time where we talk about AI or we're discussing, how AI is going to take over the world, one of the things that fascinates me about the Lumière brothers is that the cinematograph exists before there's such a thing called cinema. So even like 10 years after the invention of the cinematograph, you have practices of film attendance and film going, but the audiences, the faces that the cinematograph captures are looking at a device whose history has yet to be determined. So every time you see eyes meeting the camera, they're meeting it as a totally foreign device, or they're greeting it as a photographic lens rather than a cinematic lens. That sort of encounter fascinates me because I think within a history of technology, it's easy to narrate a rupture after the fact. This invented cinema. But even Alexandre Promiot quit working for the Lumière company or quit working with the cinematograph because he thought, who's going to want to stare at a rectangle on a wall? And he was working on X-ray photography and he was involved with the Lumière project of the Photorama and all these. So all of that said, how does this project influence humanity or what impact does it have? I think it really does hit at some of the fundamental coordinates through which the world is understood and through which there's a historical contingency even to what we call the here and the now.
No, that's wonderful. And something else I was thinking about as you were talking is, how many, students walking around on this campus actually have not lived in a time where there wasn't a screen meeting their eyes. You know, that's yeah.
Yeah. Obsolescence of media is also interesting. Like, how does a medium die? What is the extinction of a medium? But it's when a medium is surpassed, there's a sensibility and a habituation and a way of being or seeing or existing through that medium that is often grafted onto another or transmutes. But that's where, for me, transmediation is such an important question because in every historical transformation of a medium is the withering or the transformation of a sensibility that once existed alongside the medium that it's displacing.
Where can our listeners learn more about these topics?
So, yeah, none of us works in isolation, and I would say I have learned and been grateful here to work alongside my colleagues in comparative literature and in cinema studies, and that our campus is really one of those sites where my thinking around many of these questions has developed. As far as film and media scholars, Catherine Grew has a book called Bad Film Histories that's dear to my heart. Paula Ahmed has an amazing book on counter archives, also super brilliant. Allison Field, a film scholar, works on Black history and early cinema. Super fantastic new book. Aurora Spears also works on early cinema, feminist archival practices. These are all people who have inspired me and whose work I think in conversation with. And so, um, it's a garden of forking paths, but many, many different ways that this conversation uh, predates Cinema Before the World and will hopefully follow from Cinema Before the World.
Do you have any places where our listeners might be able to look up transmediation, since that's come up a few times in our conversation?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a term that's always been sacred to my understanding of what we do in comparative literature, which is to say, I understand comparative media to be at the heart of comparison. It's not just between languages, but between media. Um, I would say, certainly the term is informed for me by, German media theory, people like Friedrich Kittler, Gumbrecht, like a long history in that way. Incomp lit, I don't, I don't know. I mean, I could say I know
I think
people
we
who
have some of
practice
your
it,
essays that we can link.
but
Okay, well, thank you so much.
thank you so
I,
much for that.
I've been speaking with Michael Allan, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and author of Cinema Before the World, The Global Roots of the Lumière Brothers. The book was published by Fordham University Press on March 17th of 2026. UO Today is a production of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Thanks for listening.